screen. So, everybody, thank you for watching us. And we are going to speak today about Ethiopia and Kenya, because I think most of the people who follow us today know that Ethiopia has been accepted inside the BRICS. So a lot of people are asking themselves, why Ethiopia? And why not, for instance, another country in Africa like Kenya? We are very lucky to have with us Makadi, who live and who are from Kenya. So he is going to tell us why Ethiopia and not Kenya. And Prata has, I think a lot about the topics too, because Prata thinks a lot about a lot of things. And Voz is always with us, because what could we do without Voz?
Yes, the voice of reason.
So the first question I'm going to ask precisely, it's for most of the Western people like myself, when we think about Ethiopia, we think about famine, we think about civil disorder, civil war. And when we think about Kenya, we think about safari. We think about a problem with not enough elephant and the very evil hunter killing them one after another until there is no more elephant. That's what we think in the West. And obviously it's always false, like a lot of things about Africa. So the first question I'm going to ask you is what happened in history, in the recent history, very recent history, to create such a difference between these two countries. So in the 80s, we are going to begin with the 80s. Makadi, in the 80s in Kenya, what Kenya looks like in a few minutes.
Okay. I will start off first by, let me go ahead and share my screen here real quick.
Please do so.
So that's a very basic map of Kenya, just to give people an idea of where it is and what it looks like. And right above there, of course, is a country that's the subject of this topic, Ethiopia, right up on the north. So briefly, Kenya got its independence technically in 1963, and there wasn't much economic development as it is all the way back there. Everything was kind of new, but there was no effort to basically develop the country substantially. And as you will realize, as I explain it, that Kenya is a highly political nation, and politics literally guide everything more than anything else. So the history of Kenya is just a history of internal political struggle, and that has guided the way it looks at the rest of the world and all that. So the past president was Jomo Kenyatta, and Jomo Kenyatta was the first president. Eventually, he passed away, left it to Daniel Moi. So Daniel Moi was the president at the beginning of the 80s. He was the president in 1978 after the passing of Kenyatta. So the 80s started with a bang, because in 1982, there was an attempted coup in Kenya. And this coup was more or less almost successful, if it wasn't for the fast action of Moi. And that coup basically shaped the way Kenya was from that day on. Moi, as a president, was very relaxed at the time, but after the coup, everything changed, and the guy became very tough, and the elite that was supporting him was very terrified. So the coup was led by this guy. He was a senior private. I don't even know why their position exists, but he was a senior private. And he tried to overthrow the government using the Air Force and a bunch of students. It failed because the president of Kenya had this guy, Mahmoud Mohammed, who was a veteran of the Ogaden War, which is also very essential when you're talking about the history of Somalia and Ethiopia. And he was very experienced, brought the guy in, the guy suppressed the coup, and he was made the chief of general staff from that point. Moi then, in 1987, went ahead and introduced a new constitution where he had like all the powers at that point, which was a reaction to the coup more than anything else. And after that, the 80s just end up with just a constitutional change and them trying to see what's happening at that time. And also very important to mention as well, right before the coup, Kenya declared itself a one-party state. So there are people who say that the coup was a reaction to the end of multi-party politics. So that the military came in to more or less try and overthrow the government because of the multi-party politics, the end of multi-party politics. So the 80s was basically a one-party state during the whole 80s. But yeah.
Okay, so very nice, very short, very good. Prata, the level is very high. You have to do better now.
This is going to be so unfair. This is going to be so unfair because, guys, well, our friend Shadowi started by saying something incredibly simplest, because Ethiopia is pretty much well known for
the
these.
Western South are sometimes very simplistic.
Please,
don't begin by Lucy.
You guys need to.
The first discovered skeleton of a humanoid was in Ethiopia, and everybody that learned a bit something in history knows that Ethiopia has to do with Lucy. But of course, I don't want to talk about it. I wouldn't say that this is so important to talk about Ethiopia like it is. I think much more important to understand is Ethiopia is a civilization that exists more or less for almost 1,000 years. It started with a kingdom that was more or less Romanized and, well, actually Greek somehow. Well, they were not Greek. They had their own language. They developed later their own script. But this kingdom was quite healthy. But somewhere in time, on the 650, 700s, there was a climate change, and the people had to go up to the north, to the mountains, where it was a bit fresher, and they had a kind of renovation again on the 1200s. They built this amazing capital, Lalibela. It's one of the most important UNESCO sites in all Africa, after the pyramids. Many people don't know it. These churches were created in a single stone. Is something amazing. The kingdom was flourishing quite well, but in the 1500s, the Portuguese were going around the world, and they wanted to find this amazing kingdom that existed somewhere in the middle of Africa, because they wanted to make an alliance. The Press John. This was like a quest for the Portuguese during the first 1500s, until they discovered the Ethiopian kingdom. It was not so impressive, but in 1529, Ethiopia was about to disappear, and they asked help from the Portuguese from India. And the son of Vasco da Gama, Cristóvão da Gama, went to Ethiopia to help. And from that help, the 400 Portuguese that went there, they create a kind of a scholarship little class, and they help constructing buildings made with mortar. Mortar was actually something that revolutionized Ethiopia's arts, and they constructed a new capital, really impressive. It's called Dodar. It looks pretty much like old European castles, medieval castles, where the Portuguese in the 1500s were not constructing these castles. So this is definitely a creation of Ethiopian spirit. Nevertheless, around the 700s, 1800s, it goes down in a kind of feudal state structure. The emperor had almost no power. The country was ruled by little warlords or feudal lords. And what I wanted to say about this is that at this period, when all Europeans were trying to conquest Africa, the British tried from 1855 several times to conquest Ethiopia and lost. And why I say this? This is very important because it is this fact that the British tried to conquest Ethiopia, that Ethiopians felt they need to reunite again and fight and restructure their kingdom. They realized there is a new world out there. They were very close with themselves. And the new king that will come to power, Menelik II, a very interesting man, he tries to modernize the country. But immediately after coming to power, almost 6 years later, Italians tried to conquest Ethiopia. It was considered back then one of the biggest humiliations of the very powerful Western civilization, well, European civilization back then. And Ethiopia, nevertheless, was able to suppress the Italians, and the kingdom will enter in a kind of modernization movement. In 1906, the last emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, it would be impossible not to talk about Haile Selassie. It's an amazing man. He was in power extremely long, almost 80 years. This man is an amazing figure. He will be one of the founders of the League of Nations. So Europeans accepted this emperor, this man, as one of their own. It's quite impressive. And his father, like I said, tried to modernize the country, and he expanded the little kingdom of Abyssinia. Oh, sorry. I think I passed. Oh, yeah, here. The little kingdom of Abyssinia became the whole Ethiopia back then. He conquered the peoples, Somalis, Oromos, over it, tried to request the connection to the sea that they lost for centuries, which is Eritrea. And his son, as I said, had this spirit of renovation. He will enter in the League of Nations, I was saying. And in 1936, he has to stand one of the most barbaric invasions in history, which was Italians trying to revenge Mussolini, or fascist Mussolini, trying to revenge their humiliated proud from the end of the 1800s. And they used the most horrible techniques on war and killed thousands and thousands of people. Anyways, Menelik, Selassie had a really long list of modernization that he did in Ethiopia. Well, he ruled for a long time, but he created hospitals, universities. He created the National Bank. He opened embassies in Ethiopia in many countries from 1928. He really placed Ethiopia in the map, like let's say the modern map, in the map of modernity. Of course, Ethiopia was in 74 a very poor country, and in 74 still. In 74, we'll see is that there will be a kind of a revolution. More or less, civical servants. In 73 there was a big energy crisis, the oil crisis, and this really affected Ethiopia very, very much. And from that austerity and students revolting in the streets all the time, there was then this Ethiopian revolution somehow. There are many other reasons why. Some of them are actually the reforms from Haile Selassie, which created a lot of disaffection within the most traditional forces in the country, but at the same time, they were not strong enough to create sympathy within the modernizers forces of the country. So in 74, we had a revolution. This revolution, it's clear what they wanted. So in 75, we have this man. This man is not possible to disconnect from Mengistu Haile Mariam. He is not disconnected from the modern history of Ethiopia. He wanted to create a Leninist-Stalinist country. Leninist Marxist country. He made a lot of reforms. His term is can be described as terror, famine, reforms with no sense. He had the support of the Soviet Union, but he actually wasn't really listening to what the Soviets were saying, and it's also one of the reasons why he made so many mistakes. And nevertheless, he stayed with a very hard fist. In 1983 to 85, almost 1 million Ethiopians died of famine. One of the reasons was because he forced people from the mountains to the plateau so that they could plant more. But the problem is that the plateau sometimes exposed to droughts. And understanding there was drought, he still forced people to stay plateau instead of letting go back to the mountains. And from this forced relocation, people died in big numbers. Is one of the most horrible image we could have from the 80s. Think wherever is it at my age or more or less, we were shocked to see on television. Those images were horrible. Anyway, in 1990, there is a revolution. Well, there is no revolution. The Soviet Union falls. Mariam lost his support from the Soviet Union.
Okay,
I'm going to ask now Makadi what's happened in Kenya in the 90s. Okay? Makadi, the 90s.
Alrighty. So most of what happened in the 90s in Kenya was highly affected by what happened in 1982. As I said, the coup was defeated and a new constitution was put in. Kenya at the time, as I said, was a single party state, and there were a lot of forces fighting to put it back on multi-partyism. So that means because before it was a multi-party state, it was very difficult for them to keep it as a one-party state. So and at that time, but it's good to put something into context here. So in the 1980s, Kenya had 18 million people. And in 1990, the population had grown to 24 million. And economically, the country was not doing well, but it was not doing so bad. What I mean by that is people are still used to a lot of subsistence, and the consumerism that you see today was not present in Kenya in the 80s. People could live okay without a fridge. Now they cannot, So it's very hard to determine whether people are actually suffering or not. But as far as I can tell, there was just a whole lot of subsistence. But so in 1991, the president of Kenya agreed to multi-partyism. That's Daniel Moi agreed to multi-partyism. As far as we have read, there was a whole lot of pressure from the West, and a lot of aid was cut, and the president eventually agreed to multi-partyism, and there was the first so political parties formed themselves. And after that was the first ethnic clash was in 1991 in the Rift Valley. So the Rift Valley is in the center of Kenya. It is right here. I don't know if these guys can see the cursor. So the Rift Valley is occupied by the same tribal group, which are River Lake Nilotes and Plains Nilotes. So they kind of get along, and they usually have the same political party. So anyways, so in 1992, there was an election, and Moi won the election. And the reason more or less why he won is because these two guys, the first one is Kenneth Matiba, and the other one is Moi Kibaki. They are for the same tribe. So the Kikuyu tribe. So they split the vote into two, and that way Moi was able to win. So one of them was a plant. There's a debate as who was the plant, but one of them was a plant and managed to keep Moi up there. Jaramogi Oginga Odinga was the first vice president of Kenya, and he was also running for presidency. And he is the father of another guy we'll talk about who keeps on running all the time for president. So Moi in 1992, and that also is the beginning of Kenya as a multi-party state. And so economically, things are not going well because the rest of the world is opening up in terms of business, but Kenya is still kind of trying to struggle to figure out where it fits in the world. The country does not have a single state ideology. Moi was hated being in either camp. So he hated being looked at as if he's socialist or as if he's pro-West. He tried to play a balancing game, which was understandable. The guy was a high school principal, meaning he could not understand very complicated economic issues, and he kept things as simple as possible. So for that reason, Kenya was left behind somewhat by the rest of the world. And at the time also, they had a lot of what you call parastatals. I don't know what name other countries give them, but parastatals are basically businesses who have a mixture of private investment and government investment at the same time. So there were some of the main leading companies when it comes to energy generation, when it comes to telecom, and construction. So everything stagnated until 1997. There was another election, and Moi again won in 1997, and he was still the president. And his main opponent was actually the son of the former vice president, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. So his son's name is Raila Odinga. Now, Raila Odinga was also implicated in the 1980. He was arrested. He had 11 charges on him. Nobody knows why, but he was released. They probably made a deal or something, but he was released. 1997 was a big problem. So this election was highly contested, like insanely contested. And Moi eventually won, but Moi Kibaki, who was also Moi's vice president one time, ended up being the second most person. Now, the issue is this election cost the country a lot of money. It caused a lot of conflict, not necessarily violent, but it caused a lot of conflict, and the country was divided very clearly on tribal lines from that point. And what happened next was everybody was shocked and surprised. Of course, Moi won at this old guy. Everybody was shocked and surprised when the finance minister, the guy on the screen right now, his name is Simeon Nyachai, announced publicly that the Kenyan economy was broke. Now, this had been going on for a little bit, but nobody realized it. It's one of those situations where I'm having a problem, you're having a problem, but me and you have not spoken about it to realize that we're all having the same problem. So he revealed that the Kenya was out of gas, there was no petroleum, and people already having shortages in gas, but nobody really thought it was that nationwide. That Kenya had no money, that somehow there was an issue with circulation of cash, there was an issue with investment, and a lot of it was blamed on corruption, but most of it, I believe, was because of Moi fighting almost to the death of the country to win the elections in 1998. And from here on, Kenya does not recover for a very long time. Things look good for a little bit, but they don't really recover. And the next major event, as probably you guys know, was what do you call it? The bombing of the U.S. embassy in Nairobi. That was the first time the whole world was introduced to Osama bin Laden as a household name, you know. And that was the beginning of technically the beginning of what we now know as the War of Terror. Sorry, War on Terror, not of Terror. War on Terror. And it killed a lot of people. 224 people died or something, or to 1,000 people, something like that. And everybody's attention was moved away from the economy, and everybody now was thinking about terrorism and Bin Laden and what to do after that. But so, unfortunately, the 90s also ended up with a ban.
Okay. So
So all
no.
these people that died in that embassy, they were Kenyans or Americans?
There were a lot of Americans who died, the staffers. I don't know how many died, but there were not that many. The problem was the bomb was in a truck, and it was actually a powerful bomb, like a really, really powerful bomb. So it ended up hitting a building next to it, the one that looks like a bell bottom, the tall building. That was not the embassy. The embassy was next to it, but smaller. And that building was, I think it was a cooperative building for like a cooperative union or something. And a lot of the people in there died. My cousin actually had an office in the building next to it and literally saw the whole thing. And yeah. So that, and a lot of people in the cars, people died panicking, running. A lot of people were injured, and the whole country was like literally traumatized because before that, nothing of this nature had ever happened.
Everyone
Okay.
was asking themselves, why Kenya when this happened? Because Kenya was
Oh,
a
I think the
country in
target was
Africa.
American. Kenya was
Yeah.
just an easy way to do it.
Yes, and I think they also tried to target the U.S. embassy in Tanzania, and I think there was an explosion, but it wasn't as bad as the one in Kenya.
So, Pata, the 90s in Ethiopia.
So in the 90s, there was a lot of civil war against, movements, peoples. It was a bit disorganized, but in a way, there was, in 91, they were able to get to the capital, Addis. And in going to the capital, Mariam fled with the help of the Americans to Zimbabwe. And the country entered in a kind of conflict limbo most of the 90s. In 1993, Eritrea, so the part of made the independence referendum. They got out. In 1998, because they didn't really delimitate the borders, they started a very, very bloody war. And that Ethiopia will be marked by it. So, and that's pretty much it on the 90s. There is not much to be said. And yes, so we can go back to Nyakadi.
Okay.
For the 2000s.
Okay. So yes, so the 2000s was the same, more or less like the 90s. A lot of political here and there, and it started off with the election of a new president. So Daniel Moi had dominated Kenyan politics for 24 or 25 years, and when any child in Kenya thought of a president, everybody thought Moi. Nobody thought that Moi would ever leave. But anyways, they did. There was an election in 2002, which the former vice president of Moi, whose name is Mwai Kibaki, they're both from two different tribes, even though their names kind of sound similar. So Kibaki won in 2002 against Raila Odinga, who was the son of the first vice president, and his father had tried to become president twice before. And so Raila now, once again, this is the second time of him trying to run, decides to run for president, and Mwai Kibaki eventually defeats him. Now, there are very many issues after this, because first of all, if you look at the map below, you can see that at this point, the differences in voting are very clear. So the yellow is Odinga's majority win, and the green is Kibaki's majority win. So the country has shaped itself literally into two. Now, there's something very interesting about Kibaki. So Kibaki is the only president of Kenya at that point who knew anything about economics. He was an economics major, and he knew how a country is supposed to run. At first, he had a lot of criticism because he was very unreactive politically. He was not going in public and fighting people, and he let a lot of politicians do whatever they want within the confines of the law. Kenya developed very rapidly while he was president, and mainly is what I call Kenya became a standard nation. Before that, a lot of the development came through what they call Harambee. Harambee is a Swahili word meaning fundraising. So the president of Kenya at the time, Moi, would come out. If you guys want a school, he would come out and the whole community would put together money to build a school with him as the biggest donor for that money. That literally, that's how the country seemed to run. The problem with that, it sounds like a very interesting philosophy. The problem with that is it's nonsense, because you can't wait for the president for every single project. The country has to run automatically and build its own projects. But anyways, Kibaki was not out and about like Moi was, and things started being done in the standard way. So Kenya, Asians from India who were brought by the British to build the railway were always economically well-to-do than anybody else. What I didn't know until then, when Kibaki became president, is the first time in Kenyan history you saw people from India, Kenyan Indians basically, protesting. What are they protesting? The government told them they have to put cash registers in their business. So imagine this whole time, most of the rich businessmen in Kenya were choosing what they need to pay for taxes. So for the first time, these people were actually paying real taxes. But so all these changes are happening. Kibaki tried to propose a new constitution. It was rejected, and that was in 2005. There was a whole lot of turmoil. It was rejected, and then to 2007, there was another election. There was another election that went on in 2007. And what do you call him? And Kibaki won again. So sorry, I actually confused something. In 2002, it was Kibaki against Moi, and Kibaki won. This time it was Raila against Moi, and this is the one we're talking about. And Kibaki won. And the thing to point out here also is Raila Odinga refused the elections and said that they were rigged. And what made it worse is that the US and some European countries came out and said that they think Kibaki rigged the election. What followed after that was a lot of violence where almost 2,000 people ended up dying. Now, the reason why the West chose to side with Odinga on this one is because Kibaki was the first president to actually open up to China. Before, everything was British. Military trucks, everything were Mercedes-Benzes, which were extremely expensive. So the president said, why are you buying all this expensive stuff from the UK when you can actually buy it at half the price of China? So that eventually is one of the reasons why the West eventually went against Kibaki. Now the violence eventually ended, and there was a power sharing agreement where Raila became the prime minister. Kenya had no prime minister before that, so a position was created for him as prime minister. And if you actually notice, the timeline is actually funny, because in Zimbabwe and many other countries, for the first time, they had a prime minister. So prime minister business was actually being forced on African nations to basically weaken them. This was the time where Obama was trying to the Obama administration was fighting against what they called strongman leaders, and basically weakening them by introducing a prime minister from the opposition and splitting the power of the country technically in two. So the 2000s, thank God this time they did not end up in a bang. It just ended up with a power sharing agreement.
Okay. Poata, your turn.
Yes, so I would say a bit like Macchiati that the 2000s is also a kind of lost decade for Ethiopia as well. So what happened about that that government that followed the communism in Ethiopia was that it was kind of a federation of many small political front. Well, they were like military groups. And what happened was that many of those groups start getting out of the RPRDF, this national conference, and this transitional government of Ethiopia, and the Tigray, which is nowadays a very belligerent force inside of Ethiopia. The Tigray People's Liberation Force was actually controlling more or less things around. But there was a kind of civil war between these different ethnical groups together with military groups based on ethnic grounds and so on. What really marked the 2000s in Ethiopia is the war on Somalia. So Islamism, radical Islamism was rising everywhere in the Muslim world, or in many parts of the Muslim world, and Somalia was very hard hit by it. They also fought in completely political disarray because of it. And Ethiopia decided, because they were having a lot of problems with the Somalis, also there was from the part of Somaliland this little war trying to unite all Somali peoples together, and they enter into Ethiopia. That gave a kind of excuse for Ethiopia to actually go into Somalia and enter in that war. It was a very bloody war again. I think this is one of the things that really dominates the modern history of Ethiopia, is these extremely bloody wars that never end. And yes, and that is pretty much it. It will actually make a revolution later, but Ethiopia in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s have very little to tell besides people coming and going. I am not able to do anything so specific like Maccabi is doing. I think it's also uninteresting, because what we see here is really a country's array and completely chaos and instability all the time. And that's pretty much it.
Okay.
You're forgetting one thing. Ethiopia, I think it was the country in Africa, the economy was growing really fast.
It will. Later.
It was growing.
We have
20 years ago, you know. From 2000 until 2000.
Yes, we could talk.
17.
Well, we could talk about the pleasant revolution. It's very difficult to find information exactly about it.
Yeah,
in a way,
the thing is, when you go to Google to try to find history about these countries, you're not gonna find good things, because the people doing that.
Yeah, I was going to place it later.
Okay. Okay, Macchiati.
Because you will see in the
I thought that was it for Ethiopia, you know.
No. Okay. It goes pretty much there. Okay. There will be a complete revolution in Ethiopia. Some things happen here. You're right. I was going to tell them later, but it was a kind of land revolution where little farmers took over the land and start planting coffee and work with cattle again, a bit more in a more initiative, and this will bring fruits to the nowadays. But at this moment, if we could really look at Ethiopia like what it is, there is not much say it. Perhaps my Macchiadi has also a different picture that can help me and gives what's the perspective from Kenya from it. So what happened really in these 30 years of chaos and instability, civil wars and wars of aggression in Ethiopia, if he has a different perspective of all these.
So, Macchiadi, it's your turn.
Alrighty. So we go into the 2010s. So
Yes.
2010s basically started off the best way you can think of. Under the government of Mwai Kibaki, Kenya formed the new East African Common Market, which is intended and is still doing a really good job. It's intended to integrate the three economies into one. So this is like their coat of arms. It says here, Jumuiya ya Afrika Mashariki, which is Swahili for Community of East Africa, and which consists of technically of Kenya, Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, and there are other organizations with the same name, so it can be a little bit confusing sometimes. This is not the same as technically the East African Common Market is not what we call right now the East African Community yet. So Kibaki also at the time in the same year 2010, I believe, he started the passed a new constitution, which interestingly strongly, or I can say the most notable thing about that new constitution was the power of the president was very, very, very much diminished. But he also got rid of that stupid post called a prime minister. And now the president more or less had power, but the prime minister is gone, and most of the power was given to the parliament, as opposed to splitting it in half with a prime minister. Also, and that brought about a whole lot of changes. At the same time, there was a lot of economic developments. For the first time, we see heavy infrastructure getting built, because till this point, Kenya was depending on infrastructure that was put down by the British, when Kenya at the time had like 5 million people, but now in like 2010, Kenya had almost 45 million people.
Oh.
So the current infrastructure cannot take care of that at all. So for the first time, we see deals now between China and Kenya on building infrastructure, because when they tried to, so the Western nations were lacking in capacity to actually build such heavy infrastructure. And what I mean by that is they may have the machinery and they may have the expertise, but to actually export it abroad and actually pull it off was very difficult for them. Secondly, even when bodies like IMF and the World Bank and other European countries and institutions gave money, the problem is that money ended up inside being stolen by politicians and a lot of people involved. So most of these projects were not succeeding. But what they did, what the Kibaki government and the Chinese did, was they had the Chinese more or less build a road themselves. So there were accusations that the Chinese were bringing prison labor. Who cares? Labor is labor. And the road was built. And I heard that those prisoners also were being given amnesty if they do agree to work in Kenya. So in 2011, again, as you'd expect, the nation was picking itself up. A new terrorist group developed, and those are we call now the Al-Shabaab. And, it's always funny how those terrorist groups always pop up against the governments that don't agree with the West. It's very interesting. And the first thing they did was attack the coastal areas of Kenya where the tourists are, knowing very well at the time, and I think it may still be the case. No, it's not the case, but at the time, tourism was the most important industry in Kenya. So by them attacking coastal areas where most people come to, it seems that they were targeting the Kenyan economy. So Kenya had to react. And for the first time in Kenyan history, Kenya actually sends its troops abroad in October 2011. So the first deployment of Kenyan soldiers into Somalia was in 2011. And it was more or less, so it wasn't as big as we'll see later, but earlier it was more or less expeditionary forces to go after kidnappers and whatnot. But there were conflicts all over the northeast of Kenya due to Al-Shabaab. So in 2012, you had the first, also very interestingly, so in October, were the issues with Al-Shabaab. In 2012, for the first time, Kenya discovers oil. And that was a big deal, but it turns out the deposits were not as big as anybody thought, but it's still significant enough to provide export oil and a little bit of domestic oil because Kenya does have refineries. And in the same year, 2012 as well, about 2 months from the discovery of oil, Al-Shabaab attacked Nairobi in a shopping center. This was all over the news. I don't know whether you guys saw it. There were street fights and 30 people died or something like that, and grenades were thrown and all that. And then fast forward to 2013, you now had you had other elections. You had other elections now. This time it was the son of the first president, Jomo Kenyatta, his son Uhuru Kenyatta, and against the first vice president of Kenya, who was the rival to his dad, running against each other in 2013. Uhuru Kenyatta won, and Raila Odinga, being his third time running for president, also refused these elections. And there were a lot of conflicts that happened after that. And right before he was sworn in as president, he was taken Uhuru Kenyatta was taken to the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Now, that was before the elections. Now, the question was what was happening. There's a high possibility they were scaring him into line. They didn't possibly want to put him in prison, but they're trying to scare him into line to drop the path that his predecessor Kibaki had taken, especially with relations to China. There's a high possibility that was what the case was. Now, we know that didn't work. So first, he won the case. Secondly, the people of Kenya united around him. And his core defendant, a guy called William Ruto, eventually becomes the president of Kenya, but we're getting ahead of ourselves there. But both of them were in The Hague for crimes against humanity. He won the case and eventually was sworn in as the president. And in 2013, in September 2013, Al-Shabaab again attacked the capital city and killed over 60 people. And after that, the Kenyan military now was sent en masse into Somalia. But yeah, so that was one of the 2010s.
So there is something I need to ask you.
Mhm.
So in Kenya, you have president and prime minister.
Well, that was introduced around the same time. You remember the same time Mugabe was fighting with Changirai in Zimbabwe?
Yes.
That was introduced around the same time. A lot of African countries attained vice presidents, attained prime ministers, but then eventually they were all ditched. So now we are back to president and vice president. The difference between vice president and prime minister is that in most cases, as far as I understand it, the prime minister is chosen by the parliament, not the president.
Okay.
So the parliament, so the legislature chooses, and most of the time is from the opposition, which is insane. What is the purpose of you winning elections if the opposition is going to choose a leader themselves as well?
The prime minister had the power on the government.
Yes, had a lot of power within the government, and in most countries, including Kenya, they would share their ministries. So one party would take a group of ministries, the other one would take a group of ministries.
So Obama had his share in Kenya.
Oh yeah, no, that was a State Department policy at that point. That was a State Department policy. I don't remember what other nation, but a lot of countries were forced into that sort of an agreement after the US said, or the Western countries said, that the elections were not legitimate, which basically fuels whoever lost to start a conflict within the country. Eventually, there's a power sharing deal. Everybody shakes hands, and a prime minister is born. To be quite honest, that was a very effective strategy because it ended up weakening these countries for almost a decade.
How to make a country in a mess. They really know how to do it. They're
good at that. They're good at that.
Even their own. So, Pata, your turn.
Well, the 2010s are very...
Pata, excuse me. Could you try to right-click on the Wikipedia page and try to pin the... I think the option is pin the video, because on the screen, it's only a part of the screen with the face cam. Maybe it's only me, I don't know.
Oh yeah, Shadow, if you
continue.
If you click on the...
Continue.
So on the 2010s, the country, Ethiopia will start slowly to stabilize. One of the bigger events was the fact that new prime ministers will be appointed in 2012. Haile Mariam, he had a very big impact in developing the economy of the country. He had a lot of he had a growth transformation plan that he implemented with a lot of success, but more or less, let's say. It's also from his time that the big dam that everybody is talking about, the Renaissance Dam was started to be planning. The Great Renaissance Dam, it's a huge dam being built on the Blue Nile that will generate over 750 megawatts of energy and irrigate thousands and thousands of acres of arable land. So it's already having a big influence. So he modernized the railway, he constructs a pipeline. So actually what he done in the 2010s was to create the possibility infrastructures that allow the country to grow economically, and this will be very important. In 2018, we have another person coming to life. It will be Mr. Abiy, the actual Prime Minister of Ethiopia. He was appointed. Haile Mariam, he will quit Prime Minister, and Abiy Ahmed, which was considered already a very popular person because he was like defending the rights of the Oromo people, against opportunists that were trying to grab land from the people. He is going to be appointed prime minister because of his extreme popularity. So Abiy Ahmed has, in 2018, is collecting the fruits from the reforms from Haile Mariam somehow. And on the other side as well, he has a kind of approach of peace. He, whenever, almost right away when he comes to power, he frees thousands and thousands of political prisoners. He starts conversations with Somalia, with Ethiopia somehow to Eritrea, with Somalia to ease a bit the conflicts. And almost immediately he receives the Nobel Prize, Peace Nobel Prize, something that is very questionable nowadays. It remembers another person, another character. I think it was Obama, right? That president of the United States. He also got a Nobel Peace Prize in order to start a new war. Well, it sounds pretty much the same. So, Abiy Ahmed, this guy he's from, his father was Muslim. He's actually from a Muslim family, but the mother was Christian, and he converted to Pentecost Christians. Almost immediately when he comes to power, okay, we're already coming into the 2000s. He created, it's like he tries to make peace from one side. On the other side, he starts a new conflict. And that's what we'll see in the 2020s for Ethiopia. But nevertheless, in 2010s, the country is growing. There's a lot of new opportunities. They are having huge problem in financing. This is not unique. We have heard that also from our Angola video, how in the after the 2010s, it was really difficult to implement infrastructure project or start something, some developing projects with and getting financing. So let's also not forget that the West from 2008 to pretty much 2015 is it's really economically very bad. No? So we have all these bank scandals and monetary crisis, and these countries are very much targeted by it. What we see is actually the appearing of China as a new lander, and also Ethiopia started to have that opportunity from China. Actually, Abiy Ahmed is with some financial from China. Nobody wants to lend the money. This is a very interesting project because all Western countries are afraid. Well, Egypt and Sudan are not very keen. Then Sudan is keen on doing the projects. Egypt is not. Nobody in the West, because the West is weakened by all this financial crisis, wants to do something against Egypt. We already had the Egypt spring, which went very badly, and Al-Sisi comes to power. And actually, the West is against Al-Sisi, but also understands that he needs to be quoted. So nobody is supporting Ethiopia to build the dam. They actually made crowdfunding to start the construction of the dam. It's impressive. And later on, it was China that actually helped with the financing, at least for the turbines, the most expensive thing, almost on it. So that's it. The 2010s in Ethiopia, the change, the winds of change are coming.
Okay. So now we have less than 30 minutes left on our video time. So I just want to hear what Voz think of all of that. Voz.
Oh, we didn't do 2000s.
Yes. Ah, sorry. I just forget a few years. I'm sorry, Voz. Your turn very soon. So, Makedi.
No?
About 2020.
So the 2020
very recent history.
Just 3
Yeah,
years.
the 2020s were in Kenya were basically Uhuru Kenyatta and his projects. Now, it's very important to note that Uhuru Kenyatta is on paper the richest man in Africa. That's important to note. Um, basically because his parents more or less stole a lot of stuff and all that stuff. But him personally, he has also done a lot, especially when it comes to infrastructure development. He still kept on what Kibaki, Moi Kibaki before him had done when it comes to relations with China and other countries. Secondly, he doesn't seem to conflict a lot. Both those two presidents, Kibaki and Uhuru, they don't have almost any issue with any other African country. One of the issues I had with his opponent, Raila Odinga, who Uhuru was running after, is because he was in support of, like, let's say, arresting Omar el-Bashir of Sudan when ICC put a warrant on him. And that really shocked me. I'm like, dude, why are you asking for the arrest of another African leader? Next time it's going to be you, you know. But Uhuru made a lot of developments when it comes to infrastructure, but still Kenya is still plagued quite a lot with corruption, which is technically impossible to root out in almost any nation. The moment you have a tradition of corruption, you can't root it out. The only way you root out corruption is by what countries like Niger and Burkina Faso are doing. You have to reset the whole country. Because if you try to root out corruption, they'll just kill you, or physically, or if they can't kill you physically, they'll just make the opposition riot for another reason, but the actual reason they are rioting and burning your country is going to be you trying to fight against corruption. You can't fight against drug dealing and the same thing. So you do have all those problems. So eventually, Uhuru had promised to only be a one-term president, and he did keep his promise, and he was a one-term president. Funny enough, he went ahead and chose Raila Odinga, his previous opponent, to be his successor, which surprised everybody. But the fact that they had insulted each other for so long, the people didn't forget. So his project didn't work out. And so a new president by the name of William Ruto was elected. So that just happened, I think, last year. So we really can't say anything about the guy or his policies. But for sure, the 2020s onward, of course, we were also affected by COVID. Kenya was very strict with the lockdowns and whatnot. So there was an effect from that. But the country is in generally okay shape. Now, as to the question as why, I don't know whether I'm supposed to answer that question now.
No, not yet. In a few minutes.
Not yet? Okay, all right.
Prata. So 2020.
I said pretty much everything about the 2000s because it's a follow-up. As I said, Abiy somehow was like creating an environment of dialogue and at the same time creating an environment of conflict. So he had problems with the Orthodox Church of Ethiopia, the traditional church of Ethiopia, although 30% of the population is Muslim. And at the same time, he kind of created the environment for the Pentecosts to really came over and even take churches from the Orthodox Church, something very strange. So this is what the problem with the Orthodox Church there, but at the same time, nowadays they kind of recognize him as a good leader. So it's like a conflict of interest all the time. In 2020, the Tigray War starts. Nobody really understands the reason in a way, but we have this more or less ethnic conflict always there in Ethiopia. The southern part against the northern part is somehow always in conflict, in a conflict of interest. While they controlled most of the country after after the end of communism. Now they are getting out because Abiy is Oromo from ethnically. So in a way, the thing is that he was very violent the way he tried to control those that start of civil war. A lot of questions about the way he dealt with in terms of human rights, and the West start to put sanctions on Ethiopia. And this is also, this will initiate a geopolitical change in Ethiopia as well. It's the moment that Ethiopia turns to Russia and China for help. So the Chinese have invested almost 4 billion euros, and in the international diplomatic scene, Ethiopia always can count with the help of Russia. Also, they got weapons when the West was refusing during the Tigray War. It was Russia that was sending weapons to the government. And this is perhaps the most interesting thing about 2000, is a geopolitical shift. Of course, communism was always there, some sympathy for Russia was there, or even for the communists, but there is a geopolitical shift in 2020s, and I think this is Ethiopia we see now. Looking at what Ethiopia has become, 16% of the country, of their population, is occupied with coffee. Well, of course, Ethiopian coffee has everything to do, right? Kenya also, great countries for coffee. Well, Kenya also has tea, but Ethiopia is especially very well known for its coffee. It's one of the best paid coffees in the world. And as I was saying, so
Kenya has more.
Oh yes, it has more, but the the Ethiopian coffee is better paid. It has a higher price.
It's well branded. It's well branded.
Yeah.
Exactly. And well, Ethiopia also sells the idea that coffee is from the plant is originally from Ethiopia. It's not so true, but let's not go into it. It sells good, so it's okay. What would be Italian coffee without Ethiopian Arabica? It's almost impossible. So they sell very well their brand. Cattle. Cattle is another occupation. They have the fifth biggest population on cattle in the world. And Ethiopia was, the farmers at least, were able to improve their lives with the trade of cattle. So there is enormous, almost not illegal, but informal trade with Kenya, with Somalia, with Djibouti. The amount of cattle trade with these countries is something amazing, and has enabled the rural population to improve their life consistently in the last years. So this is also important. Secondly, is in the rapid industrialization of Ethiopia. A lot to do has the fact of the 750 megawatts that this dam, when it's fully working, it's already working, but when it's fully working, will enable their industry to work. So there is a lot of investment also taking that into account. So there is a good perspectives for Ethiopia at this moment, at least.
Oh, and by the way, it's very important to also mention that when you were talking about the reforms that Abiy Ahmed made, he actually made peace with the Eritreans. That is unprecedented. Like, that is a big deal. Making peace with your mortal enemy before anybody actually realizes that's what you're doing. That could only take a very, very, very skilled leader to pull off.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, he starts a conflict and then make peace. Or the other way around, and then again around.
Oh.
So it's like he shows the worst side of it and then say, wait, we have another solution.
But you know what he's doing? What he's doing is this. He's doing exactly what Putin would be doing. He has a high popularity rating, and Ethiopia needs to be united. So the idea that the Amhara have their own military, the Tigray have their own military is nonsense. That will be exploited in future by a hostile nation, and I think and he's aware of that. So now he's done with the Tigray. Now he's fighting with the Amhara now. Now the Tigray have been disarmed. They are quiet. Now he's towards the. And if I was him, I would do the same thing. There is no reason why one tribe should have their own military. That's insane. That's a big problem. Now the West has a problem with that because that division is what kept Ethiopia in check. And the other division that kept Ethiopia in check was a hostile Eritrea. So this guy makes peace with Eritrea, goes ahead and tackles the issue with the Tigrayans, and now he's focused now on the Amhara.
Mm-hmm. But also with Somalia. But also with Somalia, it's the same thing. He also actually the government in Somalia, the one that is there, is in very good hands with Ethiopia. They're like good friends. Mm-hmm. Now they support each other.
So
as well.
Now I want to let Voz speak because I'm sure he has a lot of things to say about everything. So Voz, what do you think of that?
I don't really have a lot to say. I just want to say most of the things Makiadi say about Kenya in the 19th years, I already knew that because Kenya was a big part of Angola. Mm-hmm. When we need to travel outside of Africa, so we needed Kenya. So that history was part of. We had to. We knew everything about Kenya. Anything that happened in Kenya was a thing to do with Angola because we need that. And the thing about Ethiopia, I don't really know a lot, but the thing I know about the country, it's like when they're talking about Ethiopia, it's like what happened in the 19th, 18th, 19th, people dying, people being skinny and stuff. But this thing happened. That's true.
Yes,
this
they
thing
did.
Happened. Yeah, things happen for sure. But the West used that like it's still going on in Ethiopia. Ethiopia changed a lot in the last 20 years. Not just 5 or 7 years ago. Now, Ethiopia changed a lot in the last 20 years. Ethiopia was the country, economy was growing too fast without the help from the West. And that wasn't a good thing, you know, because if Ethiopia could reach their goals, other African countries, we're talking about East Africa. East Africa, they are really, really quiet countries there, but come on, these people there, they have their things. They go things. No, we're not talking about like oil, diamond and stuff, but they go things like coffee and stuff, things that the West loves, like chocolate, coffee. This kind of thing is things white people, sorry about being racist, they love. And this kind of thing you find in East Africa. So Ethiopia was really, really growing really, really fast. And I don't know what happened.
No, they're still growing very fast, by the way. If you look at the fastest growing countries last year, Ethiopia was at the very top.
Top in it. Yeah, but somehow the West tried to stop.
Yes,
they make Ethiopia like it's a fucking communist country.
Ethiopia and Kenya.
And they have to stop them. And the reason why they have to stop them is this. Ethiopia, unlike Kenya, is actually an original country, for the lack of a better word. Kenya was made up by the British in 1920 as a name. We don't even know where the fuck that name came from, right? So the British made up a name, and we now call each other a nation, right?
Yeah.
The Ethiopians have always been around there this whole time as a cohesive nation that called itself one or whatever, right? So those guys, their potential is very high. Kenya is 46 tribes who speak different languages, united possibly by Swahili and English, and we have found a way to work together. Those guys have been united forever. Even when they have little conflicts here and there in between them, they still believe they're Ethiopian, but I'm a different Ethiopian than you or whatever. they have a very high potential of becoming a very powerful nation. That's why one of the things that colonial powers did more than anything else was to make sure that Ethiopia remains landlocked, just to make sure they hold them back as much as they can, which is the same thing that they're doing to Russia and Iran also. You see a potential very strong civilization, you find every single way to hold them back. Those sanctions on Iran, for example, not to deviate a lot, have nothing to do with nothing else but stopping that nation from becoming what it's destined to be.
Yes. And
Okay.
I don't know how they do it, but they always bring other countries to help them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Shadowi, the big question, the one really hard to answer.
Yes.
Why?
But sadly,
why?
you have no longer any time on this video.
But
We
what is your
only have 10
perspective?
minutes left. So
Yeah, sure. But
I just want for
Shadowi,
you.
what is your perspective?
Please. Mine, I'm going to tell you that in my closure. But I need for you, Pata, now, in a very short time, just a few minutes, to answer the question. And after that, I'm going to ask my Kiadi, Voz, and I'm going to answer myself. But please, very short, because it's going to be your closure.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay.
Why Ethiopia and not Kenya? For the BRICS.
Exactly. That's
You
the
know
big
the
question.
topic of the recording?
That's the big question.
Yes.
That's the big question that we have to make this kind of exercise, and it's difficult to answer. Well, first of all, the big question is operative. Ethiopia decided in a very, very fast way and very publicly that wanted to be part of the BRICS. I don't think Kenya did that. Kenya is actually very insecure about which position they want to really go. So at the beginning, they placed some sanctions against Russia, and then they took them out when they realized something was wrong. It was not in their best interest. But Ethiopia now, they had a very clear image. And when they make that application, make it public, it was very clear what they want. And having good relations, even if they are young, let's say, there are countries that have a longer relationship with Russia in terms of history. And they made it very clear, and I think this is the purpose why Ethiopia was chosen and not Kenya or even Nigeria, which I think it's lost on it. It's because the Ethiopians were able to create a clear, stable image of themselves. They know what they want. They know where they want to go. They know how to do it. And I think that was an easy choice for everybody. Also have good relationships, have I said, not very old, but very good relationships with Russia, China, India, the three most important ones. Yes. And that's it.
Okay. Makadi, what do you think?
What Prada said is actually very true. The main issue with Kenya is, as you said, they're insecure, meaning that they have not made up their mind on a lot of things and their direction. So they're still playing the game of trying to balance both sides here and there. Secondly, I think Ethiopia's case is very unique. Mainly because because of the various conflicts they have had within the country itself, and let's say the last conflict they had with the Tigray, the West went against them very strongly. So making that decision to join BRICS was not very difficult at all, because remember, it's a question of what is it that they can do to you that they have not done already. It's the same question that Russia asks itself before getting involved in Africa, because before they were very afraid because of the sanctions, but the moment they have been hit by all the sanctions, so now they can do whatever they want in Africa, because now what are you going to do now, right? So with Ethiopia, there's a little bit of that. Secondly, there's nothing the West can offer Ethiopia. Think about it. What is it? They don't need Western trucks. They don't need, what do? They don't need anything that the West really can offer right now. They can find alternative elsewhere. So with Kenya, Kenya still needs the West mainly because they are very weak internally, and most of the leaders are Western educated and whatnot. Britain still controls a lot of, the UK controls a lot of businesses there. In other words, they are weak and they cannot make such a strong decision.
Okay, Voz, what do you think?
Yes. Prata and Macchiati basically just went ahead of me. Whatever they say was the thing I was gonna say. But just one thing: why Kenya? Why Ethiopia and not Kenya? Kenya go the same problem like most of the countries in BRICS and the ones that just joined. That's what the BRICS want. Plus, big population, and look at the map. Look at the map, the 5 countries that just joined, gonna join BRICS next year. Yeah, look at the map where they are and which these countries represent. Like Prata said, Kenya is lost. They don't know which direction they're gonna go. They're still trying to find themselves. Nigeria is a big no because this is like just United States in Africa. That's a big no. There is no way China and Russia wanna say, yeah, Nigeria can join us. They need to sort themselves. They need to find themselves. Just realize that they are African, not American, or bridge puppets, something like that. Yes, and the big case here is Ethiopia got the fastest growing economy in Africa. That help a lot BRICS, because every country in BRICS, they are good at economy in their own ways. It's gonna get better with Argentina. They got a lot of problems, but they're gonna go better with Argentina because Brazil and Argentina, they are working together outside of dollars, which is good. Something the BRICS wants. And the same thing is gonna happen with Ethiopia and Egypt. All these countries, they got problem with IMF, my worst enemy. So
Okay.
that's
So my point of view on the question. Honestly, before this talk, I had no idea about the answer I could give to this question. But the more I listen to all of you, the more I understand that 2 points. First, about the identity of the nation. And I think you were all right to point that Ethiopia has a long history. It's it's a country with very solid roots. You know, they basically, like what I said, they know who they are. For Kenya, it's totally different. It's a new country. Maybe they still don't know who they are. Okay, they are looking for some kind of identity. So it's very hard when you don't know who you are to position yourself for the outside world. And the second point I would make, yes?
Kenya knows who they are. They just need to pick a good side. That's it.
The feeling I have is that Ethiopia is more sure about this kind of thing than Kenya. Kenya has still a lot of internal rivalry and so on. Ethiopia has the same problem too, you are going to tell me, but I think it's more clear for Ethiopia the way than for Kenya. The second point I would make is about economical situation. I think most of the progress of the economy of Ethiopia is because the help of what we are going to call the east part of the world. Russia at first during the communist time, and after that China. And the Western world give very few things to Ethiopia. Most of them was weapon to make war and corruption and maybe help relief when there was disasters, but it was not going to help them to solve structural problem. So since their growing economy was already working with the help of the east side of the world, I think it was obvious that they are going to find a better way to integrate themselves with the eastern world than the west. That's what I think. And to close the recording, I would like to thank everybody who is still watching us.
Hold on, before you
And
finish, before we go 1 or
yes,
2 minutes, please. It
please
just I
go.
want to ask Prata one thing about Ethiopia. How
Okay, go.
the percentage of Ethiopian Jews is big or just a small population?
Well, they have 120 million people.
I
It's a
know,
huge
but
population.
yes,
Kenya, it's 54. Am I wrong, Macchiati?
Yeah, 54, 55, around there. Yep.
now I'm not
Yes.
talking about population. I'm talking about the religion, Jewish.
Oh, the guys who
Okay.
call some Ethiopian Jews. Yeah.
The Ethiopian Jews were evacuated almost 99% to in the 70s to Israel, and they live miserable there. They don't even take their blood in the hospitals because they are black, and white European Jews can't have black blood on them. So I was in Tel Aviv, a beautiful city. I have an immense respect for the Jews as well. I was in Tel Aviv several times. It's a beautiful city, amazing people, very friendly. But if the black people, you don't see them anywhere. Then you go to the outskirts, living in horrible conditions, with the Ethiopians in Tel Aviv, and I presume the big part of them even live somewhere in a somehow is isolated kibbutz where nobody goes and see how bad they live in comparison with the amazing society of Tel Aviv, the very liberal society of Tel Aviv. Yes. Okay. I must also say, in the outskirts of Tel Aviv, you also have the Orthodox Jews, and they also live in miserable conditions. But they get so much money from the state, they actually don't live that bad.
Please.
Okay, that's all I want to know.
And I want to thank everybody one time again. And don't forget to subscribe to all the DPA channel and
Yes.
things. So bye everyone.